Okay, we might get started. So thank you all for attending this webinar on COVID-19, the impacts on mental health and re-traumatisation for migrants and refugees in Australia. I would like to introduce our guest speaker, Professor Suresh Sundram. Professor Sundram is Head of Department of Psychiatry, School of Clinical Sciences at Monash University, and Director of Research, Mental Health Program, Monash Health. He has been involved for 15 years in asylum seeker mental health and mental health service system development in low and middle income countries, and sat on the executive of the World Psychiatric Association section on developing countries. He is an expert consultant on asylum seeker and refugee mental health to UNHCR and has provided expert advice to the Australian Human Rights Commission, the Australian Department of Home Affairs, and non-government organisations. He previously chaired the Health Subcommittee of the Joint Advisory Committee for the Governments of Australia and Nauru on regional processing of asylum seekers, and now serves as a bilateral independent advisor, served as an external expert consultant to the Australian Human Rights Commission, and briefed the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. He is involved in specialist mental health services for asylum seekers and refugees for Australian organisations such as Cabrini Health and Monash Health. We will have an opportunity at the end for questions, so please feel free to send these through the question box. But without further ado, I would now like to welcome Professor Sundram to start the presentation. So thank you, Professor.
Great, thanks. Is everybody able to see the screen that I've got up, the slides and the like? Good. Thank you for that kind introduction, Samantha. One of the things that I've noticed in the post-COVID world is that with webinars, it's good to speak for much shorter than you would in a face-to-face lecture. So I'll speak for about 20 to 25 minutes, and that'll give us plenty of time to have discussion. Very happy to take any questions that people have about the presentation, and if there are any things that are not clear. So what I'm going to first talk about, and I understand that I'm speaking to an audience that has got considerable expertise in the space already, so I won't go over a lot of the initial introductory material that I would normally do, but I do want to provide a little bit of context in terms of the types of people that we potentially will interact with and the types of circumstances and backgrounds from which they've come. I then want to place their experiences within a mental health context. It's not possible to understand the impacts of COVID-19 unless we have quite a detailed understanding of the types of factors and issues that the people that we're interacting will bring to that space, and the sorts of issues and challenges that they're currently experiencing or were experiencing in a pre-COVID-19 world. Then what I'd like to do is to talk about the impacts of COVID-19 specifically on mental health. This is my disclosure slide. There's nothing relevant there in terms of influence on any of the material that I'm going to present today. So the reason I've put this slide up, which again, many of you will be very familiar with in terms of the catastrophic global situation with regards to displaced persons, is to highlight two important key points. The first is that about half of displaced persons in the world currently are children, which will mean that we'll have very significant numbers of children who are coming to Australia within an asylum seeker and refugee context. And the second that I want to draw your attention to is that currently, obviously with our refugee program, struggling to be able to fulfill its obligations currently, the numbers that will be coming to Australia as refugees will hopefully be able to be increased once some of the bans that have been placed on travel have exhausted, and also that the number of asylum seekers that are arriving by plane have also increased, or will be increasing. The other point that I wanted to make is about the source of asylum seekers and refugees in Australia. And many of you will know they come from countries where there's significant conflict currently or has been historically. They are currently coming from a range of East African countries, from a number of countries in the Middle East, but also from other countries in our region. These are the sorts of numbers recently, but the most important point is the number that are currently in Australia, because they're the ones that are presenting significant challenges for us and for services. Refugee Council of Australia recently tried to tote up all the figures, and this is not an easy task. They came up with approximately, or just under 99,000 people across a range of visa categories. This doesn't include refugees who've been already resettled in Australia and have some sort of connection to services, that is, people who potentially already engaged with Centrelink and social services, and also within the community. The 99,000 the Refugee Council were referring to were people who are on visa categories which potentially would place them in a situation of vulnerability if there were significant changes to employment and other factors which might then impact upon their financial and healthcare access. So significant numbers of people, and of course, as people will know, a large number are concentrated in the capital cities, in particular the East Coast capital cities, but people will also know that under shared visa conditions and also under TPV conditions, that people have moved into regional Australia, and there, in addition, will be facing considerable social stresses around employment in particular. Now, when we think about the mental health of refugees, asylum seekers in particular, but also potentially people who've migrated or voluntarily migrated to Australia, it's easiest to think about them in a fivefold model. The first is relating to factors such as pre-migration trauma and exposure to stress in the country of origin. These might well be the factors that have prompted people to leave, and although this may not necessarily apply to voluntary migration, it can still also apply to voluntary migration, in particular where there are social or cultural pressures for people to potentially emigrate. In particular, I'm thinking about women who might be in positions of vulnerability, and also people who might migrate because of, for example, their sexual orientation, but might do so under a voluntary situation rather than necessarily having to flee in a forced migration situation. The other factors related to pre-migration trauma and stress are pretty self-evident, and I'll talk about them in a moment. The other relevant factor is about pre-migration health. So it's extraordinarily important to think about people from a longitudinal perspective. That is not just the cross-sectional interaction that one has with a person at any one point in time, but to understand what might have been their health-related issues prior to leaving their country or prior to their migration journey that saw them ending up in Australia. The migration journey and the transit journey that an individual might have, as you all know, can be very simple and straightforward. That is, from an airport of a major city in their country to Tullamarine or Kingsford Smith or any of the other major international airports in Australia. Or it can be those terrible, horrendous journeys that many of us have seen on various documentaries and have read of in newspapers, or even seen face-to-face in people who've had those types of journeys, having to flee for their lives, having to take perilous boat journeys, that type of experience. The post-migration environment I'm going to spend quite a bit of time talking about. That is clearly, in the current context, the major determinant of a person's mental health, and not just the person, but obviously their family as well. And then the last point that I want to make is that one must always remember that the way that these stresses and factors impact on any one of us is mediated by our personal vulnerabilities as well as our personal strengths and resiliences, and that in turn is influenced by a whole set of personal and social resources that we can bring or unable to bring to the current set of stresses that we might be experiencing. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about that because that is an underappreciated factor in influencing people's response to the current situation and also their mental state. So the pre-migration migration trauma, as I said, the sorts of factors that people might experience are relatively straightforward in terms of being self-evident. The first one on that list, which is the agony of choice, is probably the one that's least familiar to people. But this is a factor which applies across the board to voluntary migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. The way that one can think about this is that anybody who leaves their home is, in a sense, making a choice. Now, that choice might be an involuntary forced choice. In other words, their community is about to be bombed, they themselves are about to be killed, their family is about to be murdered or caught up in a conflict. It may be entirely involuntary and forced upon them. Or it may be as voluntary as somebody choosing to leave their country to emigrate to another country for work, opportunities or better economic prospects or whatever the case may be. However, irrespective of the driving factor, one is always left with a sense of leaving behind people, be they family, be they community, be there a society or a country. And that creates in an individual a tension and an ambivalence, and that ambivalence and that tension is what I mean by the agony of choice. War is a straightforward experience in terms of we can all understand and relate to, not necessarily relate personally, but can have some inference about what the implications of a warlike experience would be. Thankfully, few people have had a direct torture experience in the refugee asylum seeker space. When I say that, probably of the people that I see, which would very much be the tip of the iceberg in terms of the most severe and most unwell people, still only about 10 to 20% of people that I see would have a direct torture experience. So it's important to recognize that torture is not a universal experience in refugees and asylum seekers. And although it's not particularly common, obviously, in individuals who have had that experience, it's extraordinarily impactful upon their mental health and their overall level of functioning. On the other hand, with regards to refugees and asylum seekers, everyone that I see, and in fact most people that you would see or have interaction with, would have some experience of a traumatic loss. And what I mean by that is the traumatic loss of family members, the traumatic loss of something to the community, their society in which they've lived, or their own personal material losses that they've experienced. And then there is also that loss that I mentioned at the beginning, which is the loss of your homeland. Irrespective of whether you're a voluntary migrant or a forced migrant, you're still leaving behind something which creates a sense of loss within you. The migration journey traumas, which I've listed here on the right-hand side of the slide, are also relatively simple to understand, and I've discussed them a little bit already. Clearly, those types of experiences, in particular in refugee camps or displaced persons camps, can be extraordinarily traumatic. They need not be. And one of the things that I'll talk about when I talk a little bit about children subsequently is that, in fact, the experience of people in very well-established, long-standing refugee camps may, in fact, be more helpful than trying to flee an acute conflict type situation in your home country, even though that refugee camp may be in a third country or an intermediate host country. The post-migration trauma experience for voluntary migrants, refugees and asylum seekers is potentially an interesting set of experiences because, again, it's a gradient in terms of the severity and the extent of the impact of the post-migration experience. It's always stressful, but for refugees and asylum seekers, it has the additional stress of the refugee determination process. And for asylum seekers, it can potentially involve immigration detention, which I'll spend a couple of moments talking about subsequently. But all migrants, unless you happen to speak with a good Australian accent and look like a mainstream Australian, you will experience some degree of exclusion, some degree of feeling like other within the Australian community. Now, again, that's going to be a gradient of experience. It's going to grade from people who potentially have a lot of personal resource, a lot of personal resilience, and who are able to integrate quickly into the Australian community, such as voluntary migrants, through to asylum seekers who may feel very excluded and very other to the mainstream Australian community. And that's not helped by adverse media, and I've got two examples there, but potentially these types of media descriptions, in particular social media, in particular mainstream media, and in particular political commentary, can have very adverse impacts upon people's mental health, in particular people who feel that their situation is one of vulnerability. So we did a study. This is community-based asylum seekers, people who've never been in immigration detention, people living in the community, and even within this cohort of people living in the community as asylum seekers, we found extraordinary rates of mental illness. So just looking here at the left-hand column here, people who had refugee status, about a third had major depression, about 27% had post-traumatic stress disorder as a diagnosis. Asylum seekers, the rates increased to about 60% with depression, about 52% or just over half had PTSD. And these rates overall give you an indication that, generally speaking, refugees and asylum seekers, anywhere between about a quarter to about a half, across a whole range of studies and a whole range of Western industrialized nations, will have some form of mental disorder. Now, the other really important point about this is that for many of these people, these disorders are unrecognized. That is, that they don't actually know that they're experiencing them, and that the impacts, in particular symptomatology, they may dismiss as just the way things are. They may underestimate their severity. They may just believe themselves that they just need to snap out of it or get over it. Really as a function of the sort of stigma and the lack of mental health literacy, which is common in many of the countries which are source countries for refugees and asylum seekers in Australia. The way of trying to think about how we end up in the situation where we have such high rates of mental disorder is to think about the sorts of factors that I've mentioned before, the pre-migration traumas, the migration journey, the post-migration environment, and the sort of psychological characteristics that they create within the individual to result in the mental disorders that I've just described. This is not an easy process of describing it because it hasn't been well described in the literature. So what I'm presenting to you now are really my personal reflections over the last 2 decades that I've been working with these cohorts of people. There are a whole set of tensions within individuals, and in particular here, I'm talking more within the refugee asylum seeker space rather than the voluntary migrant space. But refugees and asylum seekers have within them what I've termed a dialectic of hope and hopelessness. And what I mean by that is that people in seeking the refuge of a safe haven country such as Australia have an immense hope that Australia as a safe space will allow them to flourish. And they believe in their heart of hearts that that type of community and social space will be sufficient for their pain, their sense of being broken inside to be healed, and that they will be able to achieve their full potential, both for themselves, but much more importantly for any family, and in particular for children that they may have with them or may have subsequently in Australia. However, in the same space as that hope is a sense of hopelessness and helplessness, a sense that they have been somehow damaged, a sense that somehow, irrespective of how good Australia may appear to be, and I'm just using Australia here as the exemplar, how good Australia may be, there is something within them which is broken and which is not able to be fixed. And that creates within them a sense of hopelessness. They feel for the sense of their inability to fix that, and they experience, because of that, a sense of powerlessness. What that creates within the individual is a very slow and gradual destruction of a person's resilience. Now, this applies especially to asylum seekers, but also applies to refugees who, for a whole range of social factors, aren't able to regain the type of status and position that they might have enjoyed in their home country, or that they may have believed that they were capable of achieving in seeking asylum and refuge in Australia. The way that I try and present it is these 4 phases. Now, I want to in particular talk about the first 3 phases, and these are what I term the psychological phases of asylum seeking. I've given them names: the honeymoon phase, transition phase, emergent phase, and the desperation phase, and I've given you some time frames. The time frames are completely irrelevant. And I also have indicated the sense that you move from one to the next, but it's important to recognize that people can move back. So having achieved one phase, they can move into a previous phase, and also that you might have features in one phase which might diffuse into the subsequent phase. The honeymoon phase is what the experience is on arrival in Australia, and that, for everybody, voluntary migrants, refugees, asylum seekers, is once, generally speaking, of a sense of eagerness, a sense of excitement, a sense of relief, a sense of being at last in the place that they would like to be because of their perception of Australia as a safe haven. This can last for various periods of time. People during this time are, generally speaking, psychologically strong. They are able to dismiss or cover over any pre-existing symptoms. They are able to try and ride a wave of happiness, a wave of relief for as long as it will take them, and in a sense underplay any underlying symptoms that they may experience. This experience is tempered by a whole range of anxieties and uncertainties, which include all the challenges of being a migrant in a country like Australia, and these are obviously very well known to many of you, things such as learning the new language, not only learning the new language, but learning how the language is used, the idiom that is commonplace in Australia, the cultural mores, how to negotiate all the day-to-day services and activities that we need to, including things like school and public transport and all the rest of it. And then also your financial security and about what that might mean. However, that honeymoon phase, having lasted a variable period of time, will dissipate eventually. And what then emerges is what I've termed the transitional phase. This is where there are questions of doubt in a person's mind. in particular for refugees and asylum seekers, about whom they've left behind and about how it is that they may, in their own minds, feel as though they've betrayed or in some other way abandoned the people, the family, the community that is in their country of origin. They also then wonder about how good Australian society is. This is in particular an issue for asylum seekers who might have a whole set of adverse visa conditions which may prevent them doing what it is that they thought they might be able to do in terms of work and school and healthcare access, etc. And people might start to worry about how good they can make their lives in Australia, given the fact that Australia is a large society with a whole lot of inequities which are commonplace across the world. For a proportion of these people, these transitional factors, these doubts, these anxieties will start to corrode their resilience, and underlying symptoms, underlying factors, personal vulnerabilities will see the emergence of psychiatric disorder. As I said before, in refugees, asylum seekers, that's anywhere between about a quarter, sometimes a fifth, up to about a half of people will start to manifest psychiatric disorder. That's usually not immediately on arrival in Australia, but commonly will emerge within the first 12 months or so if they're living in the community, more quickly if they've had a significant immigration detention experience. We'll also start to see a whole set of clinical characteristics which are a little bit different to the standard mainstream clinical features. However, because this is not a specialist medical audience, I won't spend a lot of time talking about them unless people would like me to in the questions, except to recognise that when people start to deteriorate, that they do need certainly health intervention, and a lot of them will need specialist health intervention. So I'll move past that. I want to spend a minute or two on children. Children, as I mentioned to you, are now 50% or over 50% of displaced persons. They're very little good quality data, but we do know that there is very significant unrecognised psychological and psychiatric morbidity in children. In addition to that, there are a set of risk factors in particular for forced migrant children around the impacts, the adverse social impacts upon their parents, and therefore the ability of their parents to provide a safe, secure, positive parenting model for their children. We are also very aware of the impacts on parents' mental health, then having impacts on children. We are aware of the potential adverse impacts on nutrition and immunisation and healthcare for children, especially if they've had to spend time in displaced persons camps or when they've not been able to access those resources in their home country, and also the disruptions that children experience with regards to education. All of that place children in a unique position of vulnerability. So I'm talking here about refugee asylum seeker children. And the real challenge is that when they first come to Australia, they flee into that honeymoon phase that I described before, being in a safe environment, and they tend to cover over any of the symptoms, psychological, mental symptoms that they might be experiencing, such that those symptoms may struggle to appear, which in itself is a good thing, unless those symptoms have adverse impacts in other ways upon the child. And again, I don't have time to discuss them here, but happy to come back to that in the questions. There's a study that we're currently doing, which really shows that kids within the first 12 months in Australia have vanishingly low rates of diagnosable psychiatric disorder. That's not because they don't have psychiatric disorder, in my opinion. It's because they're in this honeymoon phase, and that if we were to continue to follow them over the next 3 years or so, we'll get the data which shows that, which is what the BNLA study, which many of you will be familiar with, shows. However, it's important to note that within the first 6 months, most of these kids were within the first 6 months, very little in the way of disorder. Older asylum seekers and refugees also present some challenges. They can do much better because they have got life experience and resilience on their part. They've managed to get through their lives, generally speaking, often in adverse circumstances. They know how to deal with adversity, but they can also have a whole set of physical health related, sensory impairment type issues, which will place them in a position of vulnerability. And similarly also that very simple things such as their ability to feel dependent on their family and therefore feel a burden on their family can weigh heavily. Now, I understand from Samantha that you've had some inputs from people describing the COVID-19 impacts in a general way, and I'm going to talk very briefly about those because you'll know them well already. Clearly, refugees and asylum seekers, and in fact a good proportion of voluntary migrants, have faced unemployment, and these groups have not been supported by any of the current government packages to any great extent. That's not universal, of course. Refugees will have had access to some of those payments, but asylum seekers and those on temporary visas have not. That creates the dynamic or potential dynamic of poverty, homelessness and destitution. And in particular, I want to raise 3 factors. One is the ability to access adequate nutrition, the ability to access healthcare, in particular, people have had to pay if they're not eligible for Medicare, and then potentially the quality of the shelter in which they're living. I've mentioned homelessness, but I also need to mention that, or flag, that people may have a roof but may not be able to pay for heating, for example. Those sorts of factors are important. There is, for in particular those on temporary visas and asylum seekers, compounded uncertainty about future prospects, whether in fact the situation will change and they'll be able to again resume their migration process, although we have been reassured that there's been no pausing of those migration pathways or protection pathways. I think the experience for most people has been that there's been a considerable slowing as resources have been diverted to address other issues and concerns. All migrants, be they voluntary or forced migrants, have got significant fear and concern over family that they've left behind, family in their country of origin. In particular, those people are from countries like the United States, for example, or also from developing countries around the globe. That's going to act as a significant stressor. I again want to mention the impacts on children, and in addition to the ones that I've mentioned above, the loss of school support. Now, what I'm talking about here is that for many refugee and asylum seeker children, school is a normative environment. It gives them exposure to peers, gives them exposure to children who they can relate to as an aspirational normative model. They can also see adults, such as the teachers, who are normal functioning adults, and it provides a psychological respite from the turmoil and trauma and challenges that they may be experiencing in their home environment. So the loss of that school environment has had a very negative impact on many refugee and asylum seeker children. In addition to that, the resources for homeschooling have been, for many of these children, inadequate. And the problem has been that parents who are extraordinarily fearful, parents who've been affected by mental illness, believe that their children are at risk of contracting the infection, and so have not taken advantage of allowing their children to attend school, when in fact it would have been much better and probably much safer for them to have continued to attend school during the pause in schooling. However, a whole set of family factors prevented that from happening, and there may not be adequate resources at home to provide for adequate schooling. And then I've mentioned already the impacts of poverty on nutrition and healthcare access, which is again going to be compounded in children. All of these COVID-19 factors that I've just mentioned before have led within, in particular, the forced migrant cohorts to very high levels of anxiety, stress and fear. We are seeing this probably over the last 3 weeks or so. I think it's going to continue to escalate despite the fact that the restrictions are reducing for the mainstream community. I think these mental health impacts are going to continue to grow, unfortunately. The real problem has been, or not the real problem, but a real problem has been that very tenuous and vulnerable and fragile social relationships have had to be truncated, and that's led to the re-experiencing of social disconnection, social isolation for, in particular, forced migrants. And it's going to be a very difficult process for them to be able to reconnect with the communities and societies in which they live. And that's going to continue to be a significant ongoing stressor. And the way that all these stresses are going to play out is in the recurrence and exacerbation of psychiatric disorder and psychological distress. Now, clearly, if they've got diagnosed disorders, that's what's going to come back. In particular, even if they've been well treated, they're in remission, we will see a recrudescence of those disorders. I'm already seeing a recrudescence of those disorders. In addition to that, and this is problematic, substance use has become a way of, unfortunately, coping with the social isolation and disconnection. We've noticed even in the mainstream Australian community an increase in the amount of alcohol consumption, and that potentially places these groups in particular in a vulnerable situation. And unfortunately, again, a mainstream effect in terms of family violence, but here again, it's going to cause significant disruptions. And the final point that I want to make is about suicidality. What I want to say about suicidality is that even though we will anticipate to see an increase in suicidality across mainstream community, when you think about the impacts of social disconnection, social isolation, and a vulnerable sense of being alienated from mainstream society that forced migrants, both refugees and asylum seekers, experience, we will see an increase in suicidality, especially when it's compounded by a lack of any family support or immediate social support. So what I might do is I might stop there, Samantha, and very happy to take questions or to elaborate on any points that people wanted to raise.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor. That was very insightful. And I think just giving the background around, I guess, the mental health for migrants and refugees, but then also looking at the impact of COVID-19 specifically is really helpful. So thank you for that. We'll just open up for questions now. So if you can please send them through the chat box, that would be wonderful. Some people have sent some already through, so I'll just go through what has already been sent, but please do continue to send any questions through. So Professor, you mentioned about the guilt that I guess refugees and some migrants have with leaving family members at home. Has this been exacerbated, would you say, within the COVID-19 context?
Yeah, so absolutely. It's a real fear that people have now that they've in particular abandoned their parents in particular across a whole range of different countries, that people are not going to be able to, family members are not going to be able to survive the COVID epidemic, in particular in low resource countries. But as I said before, this is also a major factor with the United States, for example, and obviously some European countries. But as the pandemic takes hold, in particular in South America and in Africa, we're going to see large numbers of people dying, and that's going to weigh very heavily on refugees. Well, as I said, across the whole migration spectrum, both voluntary and forced migrants.
Absolutely. No, thank you, Professor. Next question is, are we seeing a spike yet in relation to family and domestic violence, or are they presenting in more complex ways? What about children? Is there any visibility into this?
Yeah, so I've been obviously in close contact with my child colleagues. We've not yet seen impacts on children who are presenting to services. Now, I understand that many of the people in the audience here might already be having interactions in a welfare type space, and they may be aware of these types of violence being perpetrated against children, but they haven't yet hit the front door of health services. I think if people are seeing children being exposed to violence or potentially to harm, that it's very important that obviously they're going to act on it, but that also that's more highly publicised, because that would be very important. On the other hand, in terms of intimate partner violence, we are already beginning to see that. So we're seeing, in a way that's really different to the way it's been previously, we're seeing, so specifically or generally, women presenting with health-related issues and mental health-related issues, but with a little bit of sensitive probing, it's been able to be determined that maybe much of their distress is related to violence in the family setting. So that is new, and it does seem to be much more prevalent than it has in the past.
Absolutely. Next question is, what do you perceive as the greatest barrier to newly arrived migrants and refugees engaging with mental health services, and what can we do to help?
Yeah, so no question that there are two major factors. The first is an absolute lack of mental health literacy. That is, people come from countries or come from regions where mental health is not really well understood. They don't recognise that the symptoms and experiences that they're having are related to mental disorders, and that these are potentially able to be treated such that they don't have to experience them anymore. So mental health literacy is very important. The other key factor here is stigma, and stigma is very widespread throughout the globe, such that even if people recognise that they might have something wrong with their mind, they nevertheless would prefer to ignore or cover over those symptoms rather than to acknowledge them or to get treatment. Now, we've recognised this problem for a number of years, and what we've done and what we're rolling out to a number of service agencies, and some of you on this call may already be aware of it, is a screening tool for adults, so screening mental health problems in adults, which is a very quick 5-minute tool that anybody, any worker can use without any prior training. So you don't need to be a health practitioner or a mental health practitioner. You can use the tool, which will then indicate the likelihood or otherwise of an individual having a mental disorder that then needs further assessment by a primary health or specialist mental health provider. So that screening tool, I think, as many people will be aware of it, but that's something that people can do.
Wonderful. Thanks, Professor. Next question is, are there certain populations who are more susceptible to re-traumatisation? And if so, who?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. So the groups that are going to experience re-traumatisation is actually in that re-traumatisation word. That is, they've had a previous experience of significant trauma. It doesn't matter what the nature of the trauma is, but if they've had a previous experience of trauma, and it can be even in an Australian context, so it can be something like, say, an immigration detention experience. It doesn't need to be from country of origin, but anybody who's had a previous trauma will be the people who will experience a recrudescence of their symptoms in the current context, not because they've had another new trauma, but because the stresses that they're under, as I've described, will corrode their resilience, and in corroding their resilience, their underlying symptoms will re-emerge.
Absolutely. There's another question here that some of the clients that this settlement provider has seen have recently gone through the bushfires and have had to evacuate. And now with isolation, is there any way that we can be more prepared to support, I guess, clients, migrants and refugees, for future disasters and for future pandemics?
Yeah, that's another great question. So the real thing that we've learned about this is that people who can cope with adversity and can cope with these types of impacts will, generally speaking, cope with these types of impacts. But challenge is that people who are carrying a very significant previous trauma load will be the ones who are going to be most significantly impacted by a new additional or subsequent trauma or set of stresses. So what we want to do is actually do something preemptively, which is to identify people who are vulnerable and to be able to recognize that when a new stressor, such as a pandemic or a bushfire or whatever it may be, is about to hit or is going to hit, that those are the people that we turn our attention to. Although there is value in a general whole of community response, you're going to get a much, much better impact and effect if you're able to target your interventions to those people who are most at risk. And those people are the ones who are already carrying a significant trauma burden. So going forward, what we should be doing is identifying people who do have those characteristics and those vulnerabilities, and then to be able to plan to intervene for them in anticipation of the next impending stressor.
Absolutely. We've got a couple of questions just asking about the mental health screening tool and where can people actually get access to that?
Okay, look, I'm very happy to send that through to you, Samantha. It's called the STAR MH, and we're trying to get it up on the web at the moment. It's paper-based, but I'll send it to Samantha and then you can just disseminate it.
That'll be wonderful. Thanks, Professor. Another question is, has there been any studies done that link the experience of migrant and refugee racism experiences or discrimination experiences and the impact that this may have on their overall mental health?
Yeah, so there hasn't been a huge amount of work in an Australian context, but there's been a really considerable amount of work done across both European and North American contexts. And not to say there hasn't been Australian work, but most of the work has been North American and European. Racism is a very, very, very powerful stressor on individuals who've experienced racism. And so we can categorically state that irrespective of the individual, being exposed to racism is a profound stressor, and that although there are multiple ways of trying to deal with to individually deal with the psychological effects of racism, we should identify racism as a strong traumatizing factor, and that we should take that into account in understanding the psychological state of the individual. And that's, again, I'll single out children who are exposed to racism are particularly vulnerable.
Absolutely. You touched on children and also older adults. What are some of the impacts of COVID-19 specifically for young people, so for youth and adolescents?
Yeah, so the impacts I think I sort of described a little bit, which has been the impacts around the loss of social supports, the loss of social connection for kids, and that's both within the schooling environment and also within the peer environment. So kids who've lost interaction or engagement with, for example, their sporting clubs or their other extracurricular activities, that's been a significant loss, in particular for forced migrant children who may have limited opportunity to engage in other activities, even because of their financial situation, for example, or financial situation of their parents. In addition to that, I've made reference to a lot of home environments being inadequate for homeschooling, and as a consequence of that, kids will slip or potentially will slip behind in their educational performance, and we need to be conscious of that. And then the final impacts are the impacts upon their parents, and what again they may see are their parents being very adversely impacted by the stress of COVID and the associated stresses, for example, of unemployment, potential destitution, poverty, and that watching their parents or observing their parents in a very weakened state has a very negative psychological impact on children across the entire age spectrum.
Absolutely. We just have another question about, is there an association between memory and memory loss and trauma, as some clients for this particular service provider seems to be showing evidence of that. So we're just wanting to know whether there's a link between them.
Yeah, so you know, there are books written on this topic, but there are two key elements that are important here. Firstly, forgetting is a critical element of trying to address trauma. So if you like, a psychological defense mechanism against the horror of trauma that an individual has experienced is forgetting. Now that works for some people, it doesn't work for other people. There are a whole set of factors which will determine whether an individual is able to forget a trauma or not. And when I say forget, I don't mean that they're actually able to forget it, but that they're able to suppress it such that they don't have any active symptoms from the trauma itself. In addition to that, trauma in particular in children can have, but also in adults, can have impacts upon an individual's subsequent memory, so that trauma in itself can impair new memory formation. So people will describe this, and we have some evidence to suggest that cognition and memory is impacted. And the third component is that the trauma itself might lead to psychiatric disorders, in particular the two that I mentioned, major depression and post-traumatic stress disorder, but also in certain circumstances, substance use disorder. And all three of those disorders have profound impacts upon memory and more generally cognitive performance. So there are three ways in which trauma can impact upon memory.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Professor. Next question, are there particular strategies to assist with reconnection once COVID-19 restrictions enable service providers again to offer opportunities for face-to-face engagement?
Yeah, so look, I can't overemphasize the importance of face-to-face engagement. I know that we're doing this talk by a webinar, and it potentially works very well for most of the people in the audience. However, for people who actually are experiencing in a bodily way social disconnection, alienation, a feeling of being excluded, having the physical presence of somebody is enormously validating for them. And I would encourage service providers who had the opportunity to be able to re-engage in a physical way, obviously observing social distancing, but physically re-engaging with people, even though I know how convenient it is to conduct interviews and other such things by phone or by web link. It is actually, from a personal human experience, extraordinarily validating to have somebody present.
Absolutely. Last question before we finish up. What is the one, it's probably linked to your last question, but what is the one thing that service providers should focus on to support their clients through COVID-19?
Yeah, so certainly that being able to actually physically engage with people. I'm hopeful that service providers have also recognised that with the telephone conversation or the video conversation with people, that they can be much briefer, but if they're much more frequent, that's very helpful. So you might address some of that loss of direct contact by increasing the frequency of this telephone-based indirect contact. However, when it's possible to re-engage from a physical perspective, that's going to be very important. But what I would stress to service providers is to try to engage and understand about the physical, when I say the physical, the material impacts of COVID-19 in the first instance, and then to use that engagement as the vehicle to explore the sense of isolation and disconnection that people will have. So don't jump to the social isolation and disconnection, but approach it in an indirect way through the loss of material resources that many of these individuals will have experienced.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for answering all those questions, Professor, and for your presentation today. It really did shed some light into the impacts of COVID-19 specifically on migrant and refugee health, mental health. And we really appreciate you sharing your knowledge and expertise and taking the time to present to us today. Thank you so much.
No problems. Thanks, Samantha. Thanks everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Take care. Thanks. Bye.